side, sparked an intense public controversy. The senators' attempts to put a positive spin on what even Stephen Harper, the Conservative Prime Minister who appointed Beck to the by many fellows or chair who said that church within the country, including the Pelican Lake where Beck lived, weighed into to verify that it good school. He noted it well. Survivor of school experiences, a personal individual. Those experiences not being those experiences wider of a genocide school system designed for the Indian. The refused to for her comment. Instead, this criticism they simply on her arguing they're shining school. When pressed on how Indigenous peoples, especially the many former students who were physically in school, might feel they collaborate, suffer suffering more than they'll ever, but the best forward together, not point not in the past. You know, you've read when the a satirical like the has a good sense right here and support to better understand the history and ongoing legacies of the schools. Beck simply stated, and this is important, quote, "I don't need any more education." As a result of her comments, Beck was removed from the Senate Committee on Indigenous Issues in 2017, and she was later kicked out of the Conservative caucus. But she retained her Senate seat for another 4 years and used her platform and position to popularize residential school denialism, which, to be clear, good definition, is not the denial that the system existed, but rather by definition, denialism is the rejection or the attempt to twist, misrepresent, distort, or discredit basic facts rooted in well-documented evidence in favor of more controversial positions. In this way, residential school denialism is similar to other kinds of denialism popular in today's age of misinformation, such as climate change denialism or science denialism. Denialism in general is a deliberate strategy used to try and shake public confidence in something. In this case, it is about truth and reconciliation, and I'll explain why in a moment. And that's essentially what Nina Green emails are trying to do as well. Okay. So while not wanting former students of residential schools to dwell on their victimization at the hands of state and church officials, in the aftermath of her 2017 comments, Beck quickly constructed herself as a victim of politically motivated attacks on, quote, free speech. Rather than reflection, Beck dug in and fortified her position by using her Senate website, here, this is a screenshot, to post the full text of her speech, as well as further personal statements and a selection of letters she received supporting her comments. It's tempting to stereotype those who engage in residential school denialism as ignorant bigots, or to simply ignore them so as to deny them the recognition they seek for themselves and their ideas. Silence, some say, starves deniers of their sustenance, which is dialogue. Some turn to authority, that is institutions, police, or even the state, to shut down talks or acts of denialism, but this often tends to give denialists what they want most, which is a larger platform to spread their ideas further. Maurice Sinclair, however, suggests a different approach that I try to amplify and build on in my work, and I want to emphasize today and invite others to consider. So Sinclair argues that it is not enough for us to simply yell at denialists and knock them down. Instead, we need to try to understand their reasoning and show that they are wrong. He elaborates, saying, quote, "I've always been convinced that that while we may not be able to deal with all of the denialists, we can at least take away their tools. By challenging the comments of high-profile people like Beck and others, Sinclair is hopeful that denialists will have a diminishing population of people who will believe them." Sinclair, in short, advocates a strategy of engagement to contain, disprove, and discredit denialism. Taking away the tools of residential school denialists, though, requires a better understanding of those tools and how and why people employ and defend them. In that spirit, my work documents and interrogates the Beck controversy as a way of comprehending and confronting not just Beck, but the phenomenon of residential school denialism in Canada generally. So that's what we're going to do today. Since I'm talking to fellow historians, I want to begin by emphasizing that residential school denialism is actually not a new phenomenon. Indeed, downplaying or minimizing the destructive effects of residential schooling for Indigenous children has a long history in Canada, going back to the origins of the system officially in the 1880s. For much of the system's history, state and church officials likened the schools to a humanitarian, even sacred or divine in the Christian sense, enterprise designed to save Indigenous communities from extinction in the face of a so-called higher form of civilization. That was the rhetoric that was often used and deployed. Even when faced with irrefutable evidence of poor instruction and horrific conditions in many of the schools, officials mostly clung to the humanitarian discourse and discredited the system's detractors, including some Indigenous parents and students, of course, but also non-Indigenous experts as well. In the early 1900s, as the system was still getting started, Dr. Peter Bryce, for example, published a report for the Department of Indian Affairs. He was their health expert, slamming residential schools for their abnormally high rate of student death and disease that he argued was exacerbated by overcrowding, poor nutrition, and a lack of proper sanitation at many of the schools, which is a direct result of the underfunding of the system. Instead of rectifying the system's obvious problems, the department buried Bryce's report. As a medical expert working for the Department of Indian Affairs, Bryce tried to blow the whistle on the school system in its initial phase. Right? We often hear you can't criticize the past by the values of today. Well, even using the values of 1907 when Bryce was working, right? He goes on to call this the story of a national crime, even self-publishing his findings after he gets pushed out of the public service and is silenced by the Department of Indian Affairs. And the DIA decides to instead selectively focus on the positive results the system was having, or more correctly, that they hoped it would have, and the system was allowed to continue to the mid-1990s. It's not until former students began publishing accounts of their abuse in schools and organizing for redress in the 1980s that this humanitarian discourse about residential schooling starts to shift significantly in the mainstream. As more students spoke out about their experiences at school, they emboldened others to come forward, eventually sparking a movement led by former students to collectively seek compensation for their time spent in the institutions. With many state and church officials still denying any wrongdoing in the 1980s and 1990s, students forced the issue further by launching the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, which the government of Canada chose to settle out of court by agreeing to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2006-2007, which then put in motion the government's official apology in 2008 and the TRC process to research and raise national awareness about residential schooling. All of these were parts of the remedy of this lawsuit, not because the government of Canada had a change of heart. They were forced into this position. They realized that that this settlement would save them a lot of money, and so they pursued this particular path. The TRC then published its final report in 2015, and the conclusion shocked many Canadians, but confirmed what generations of Indigenous peoples and historians already well understood. The Commission, however, made clear that shaming and pointing out wrongdoing was not actually the TRC's mandate. Instead, the focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation, or strengthening relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. They argued that we must have truth before reconciliation. Now, many Canadians have embraced the challenge put forward by the TRC and are in differing ways engaged in reckoning with Canada's colonial past to create a better future. Others, like Beck, however, are choosing to dispute, deny, distort, or discredit the Commission's findings as an excuse to avoid participating in reconciliation. You don't have to deal with a history that you deny. To be sure, grappling with matters of genocide is not easy, but it is the task that Indigenous and, in particular, non-Indigenous peoples such as myself living in what is currently Canada are being asked to do in this moment of truth and reconciliation. So how can we learn how to do this better? Well, the scholarly literature in the field of genocide studies can help shed light on how different countries around the world are dealing with the legacies of different kinds of genocide and addressing the phenomenon of denialism in particular. It is often said that denial is the final stage of a genocide. So I think an interdisciplinary lens is very helpful here. Political scientist Adam Jones argues that the manipulation of memory and history often occur in the aftermath of genocides. And looking at Germany's grappling with the Jewish Holocaust as an example, he shows how a willful amnesia and a politicized forgetting emerged in the immediate post-war period as a way to distance the country and its citizens from its very recent Nazi past and its ongoing effects. In reflecting on the psychology of denialism, Jones argues that individual and collective narcissism play a pivotal role in buttressing denial. In many contexts, a denialist stance heads off cognitive dissonance between one's preferred view of self and country and the grimmer reality. He also mentions that there's usually an element of material self-interest. Insights from genocide studies overlap with lessons from recent Indigenous studies literature on the role of denialism in Canada. Scholars such as Gina Starblanket and Dallas Hunt illustrate how Canadians like to imagine that they've always acted with peaceful, good intentions. Canadians do not like to hear that their country was founded through frauds, abuses, and violence perpetrated against Indigenous peoples. Instead of confronting this reality, Canadians seek refuge in myths of benevolence and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that justify colonial policy, and we know many of these myths as historians, right? That Canada's well-intentioned, the colonial policy was even necessary or enlightened. To be Canadian, according to Stolo writer Lee Maracle, is to be sunk in deep denial. Instead of reconciliation, instead of seeing reconciliation as an opportunity to change their relations to these lands, Maracle argues that many Canadians, quote, tend toward defensiveness. It's also helpful to theorize the role of denialism in colonial societies. And here I turn to the work of anti-colonial writers A.M. César, Frantz Fanon, and Albert Memmi. In particular, Memmi's The Colonizer and the Colonized, one of my favorite texts, which consists of a psychological profile of both based on the author's experiences in North Africa, is especially insightful because it looks at the role of denialism in legitimizing colonialism as commonsensical. So I want to pause on this theorization for a moment. Well, Indigenous scholars, such as my colleague here at the University of Manitoba, Emma LaRocque, have examined Memmi's portrait of the colonized in relation to Indigenous struggles in Canada. I think it is helpful to focus on Memmi's portrait of the colonizer and its applicability to Canadian settlers. And this aspect of Memmi's work has received less attention. Memmi argues that colonizers are daily confronted with the reality of the illegitimacy of their status. Their very existence is a crisis of legitimacy. Whether colonizers are immigrants or are born in the colonies, they are always, even if only subconsciously, plagued by the question, what entitles me to live here? Fears about retribution and revenge by the colonized only stoke an kind of ever-present colonial anxiety, as I think Starblanket and Hunt's new book on the Gerald Stanley trial and settler reason make clear is in existence here in Canada too. In an attempt to resolve these unsettled feelings, colonizers invent and deploy a whole host of strategies to protect their position of privilege in the colonies and to prove to themselves and to others the legitimacy of their existence, their right to live and prosper. In addition to creating specific laws and the creation of things like ghettos, prisons, and schools to contain and control the colonized physically, Memmi contains that colonizers invent and invest themselves in a series of myths and stereotypes propagated through various channels, including art and education, the writing of history, to rationalize the oppressive colonial relationship that underpins the material prosperity of colonizers as natural, inevitable, and most importantly, unchangeable. Although Memmi argues that all colonizers benefit from colonialism in different ways, he differentiates the behavior of two main groups: the colonizer who refuses and the colonizer who accepts. In short, the colonizer who refuses comes to the realization that colonialism is in fact unjust and vows to challenge the oppression of the colonized and fight for their freedom. This is no easy task, however, because the liberation of the colonized requires colonizers to question and challenge the legitimacy of their own existence and change their relationships to society. As a result, Memmi argues that most colonizers simply resign themselves to accept colonialism and its benefits, becoming colonizers who accept. All right, properly historicized, contextualized, and theorized, I argue that denialism can thus be understood as a powerful tool for protecting the status quo in colonial settings, including Canada. Rather than unsettle the history of Canada and confront the ongoing legacy of colonization, including things like residential schools, as Memmi's The Colonizer Who Refuses might do, some Canadians, like Beck, are employing the tools of Memmi's The Colonizer Who Accepts. That is, they deploy a denialist discourse in various ways that justifies their existence, their home on native land, through a combination of degrading Indigenous peoples and clinging to selective and self-congratulatory accounts of the past that they think absolves them of any wrongdoing, and thus justifies their lack of support for reconciliation. Okay, back to Beck. Senator Beck's controversial comments in the Senate in 2017 defending residential schooling and the kinds of comments they catalyzed need to be understood in this wider context as a strategy, as a tool, as Murray Sinclair might say, for denying the injustices of the past and present to safeguard colonial power and privilege in the unsettling time of truth and reconciliation. I don't have time to fully get into Beck's speech, which you can find online, but just a couple of points before I move on to talk about her support letters, which is really, I think, the focus of my analysis and showing how denialism spreads. Excuse me. Beck's speech promoted a whole host of ignorant and incorrect views about Indigenous peoples, including her belief that, on balance, residential schooling should be considered beneficial for Indigenous peoples. In her speech, Beck used what is known as false balance, a form of bias that suggests an issue is more balanced between opposing views than the evidence actually suggests, to contend that the good and the bad are equal parts of the whole residential school story. Beck explained that people only focus on the bad for political reasons and noted that it was her duty to stick up for, quote, the other side. The problem with Beck's premise is that it is not supported by the evidence or historical scholarship. Beck's equal weighting of good and bad reveals her misunderstanding of the historical consensus that the problems of the Indian residential school system were systemic. that the problem with residential schooling was not only the individual cases of neglect and abuse, but that for over 100 years, the government colluded with churches to devise, deploy, and defend a genocidal school system that removed children from their families, often by force, to undercut and attack Indigenous lifeways to support colonization and Canadian nation building. Whether some former students recall positive experiences, which they do, or whether employees believed in their benevolent intentions, which I think makes sense, and the TRC does acknowledge this. I also acknowledge this in my own work. All of that doesn't change the genocidal effects of the system. Despite the inaccuracy of her comments in the Red Chamber, Beck nevertheless received a lot of support for her comments. On the 6th of April, 2017, a month after making her speech, Beck used her Senate website to release a statement defending her position and thanking people for their support. She claimed that her supporters represent the silent majority of Canada, and she wanted to write to encourage their support. She says, "You are not alone. You are the majority, as has been shown to me with all of the support I have received." You can get a sense for where this is going to go. Though declaring that the majority of Canadians supported her position based on, quote, an avalanche of support, Senator was pretty cagey when pressed on evidence for that support. They claimed to have received 700 letters that overwhelmingly supported her views. This, however, does not reflect reality. An investigation by the Senate ethics officer into Beck's use of her website revealed that the senator, in fact, received a total of 6,766 letters. Of that total number, only 2,389 supported Beck's speech in the Senate, while 4,282, the vast majority, were partially critical of her speech. Though promising to make all of the letters publicly available, Beck only published a handful of these statements, 129 in total, and all of them in support of her comments in 2017. So you can get a sense of the misrepresentation of evidence here that is often at the core of denialist discourse. Though she deleted all of the letters in 2019, I downloaded them before she did that. And I think that they need more critical analysis, especially because the 100 letters dated between the 8th of March and the 11th of April, 2017, in the month after Beck's speech, openly engage in residential school denialism and show how mis and disinformation can grow and spread quite quickly. So turning now to the selected support letters that Beck chose to showcase on her website between 2017 and 2019, I just want to give you a sample of them today. And I cluster the comments into three broad categories that I think if you look at other examples of denialism, whether we're talking about Nina Green emails or whether we're looking at online comments, online articles, controversial podcast appearances, etc., we can see some of these talking points coalescing around these three clusters, as I'm calling them. The first is personal knowledge. The second is ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism. And the third is something I reference as worldviews in collision, or those that openly promote assimilation and coercion. And what I want to show is that those writing in support of Beck drew in differing ways from all of these categories to further advance denialism in keeping with Memi's view of colonizers who accept. Okay, let's start with the personal. Many of Beck's support letters defend residential schools based on various kinds of personal information. Some authors admit to having direct experience working in the schools, and it is clear they are seeking refuge in Beck's comments as a kind of absolution of wrongdoing for themselves and family members. The very first letter to be posted on Beck's website, in fact, is from Richard, who writes on behalf of himself and his partner, who have a combined experience of 26 years in Aboriginal and Métis schools, and thus witnessed firsthand the positive anecdotes and experiences of those who gained from their attendance at residential schools. And there's quite a few of these direct family connection support letters. So while some authors chose to defend their work or the work of family members in residential schools, others spoke of their positive personal experiences of talking with Indigenous people. Here we have a writer who wrote to thank Beck for, quote, having the courage to say what millions of Canadians have been thinking for years, that yes, there were terrible things that happened at residential schools, but not everyone that attended a residential school had a bad experience. The author bases this conclusion on her experience of once attending an art exhibit in Fort McMurray in Northern Alberta, where she met a Native artist who told me how grateful she was to the nuns and priests in her community who ran the school. All of these writers thus gained personal knowledge from family members or former employees or students who spoke favorably about their time in residential schools for a variety of reasons, maybe even just to make a sale. And thus they have a hard time accepting the overwhelmingly documented evidence about the system's overall genocidal effects. Right? They can't square it away. While some authors wrote to support Beck based on their personal experiences, others admired the senator's stance on residential schools simply because it created a space for them to voice their ignorant views about Indigenous peoples and openly perpetuate anti-Indigenous racism. These writers remain unconvinced that they should care about Indigenous peoples, and as a result, they generally accept, buy into, and even propagate racist stereotypes that demean, diminish, and dehumanize Indigenous peoples, and deny any responsibility for colonization and, by extension, efforts at reconciliation. And the worst of these letters have gotten a lot of public attention. I addressed them in my peer-reviewed article. If you'd like a copy, I can send it to you afterwards. So I'm not going to give the most racist ones more of a platform here. I think you can imagine some of the tired stereotypes that are used in these letters. But I want to give you a sense of some of the ignorance on display. I think that's instructive. So in terms of ignorant views, Beck's support letters, like Beck's original speech, are full of incorrect assumptions rooted in misinformation, and denialism, in fact, thrives on it for its survival. Kevin writes, your remarks to the effect that teachers and leaders involved in the program were by and large well-intentioned are obviously true. It's too bad you are under attack for speaking truthfully. The evidence presented by the TRC reveals that such an assumption is in fact not obviously true. Similarly, C wrote to support Beck and explains, I feel that the current dialogue, re this part of our history, is grotesquely unbalanced. You are right to mention that it was neither the residential school employees or government intention to be cruel or to wipe out an entire race. Again, we can see the idea of false balance on display here. And the TRC report and the weight of scholarly research, including my own, presents the evidence to show that while not all employees were cruel, many were. And the government's clear intention from the beginning was to use the system to kill the Indian and the child and bring about the end of Indigenous lifeways through coerced assimilation to support Canadian nation building. Though many of the support letters Beck received used personal knowledge or racist and ignorant views to downplay the negative effects of residential schooling, others simply doubled down on the need for assimilation to force Indigenous peoples to participate in Canadian society. And this aspect of the letters, and denialism generally, has received less attention but needs to be directly confronted. Many of the authors cannot or are unwilling to comprehend that Indigenous peoples have their own cultures, languages, spiritualities, and economic practices that the residential schools deliberately and systematically sought to eliminate, eradicate, and replace, borrowing the language of scholar Patrick Wolfe. Simply put, many letter writers lament the closure of the schools because they still believe in the value of coerced assimilation as a beneficent project of civilizing Indigenous peoples. For example, Linda wrote to Beck, like you, I believe the institution of residential schools was well-intentioned and was an attempt to solve the Indian problem by integrating the children into the new way of life in order that they could function with better language health and skills. Similarly, Terry, in a letter that draws on all of the categories here, argues, certainly the decision to assimilate First Nations into Canada was and remains the correct one. B takes it further, suggesting, I think residential schools were a noble and honest attempt to treat Natives as equals and integrate the community into the new, productive, rewarding Canadian life. Roy personified the unquestioned acceptance of assimilation by defending residential schools in the most self-centered, ethnocentric way possible. He says, the fact is there are two good things that came out of residential schools. One, when I see an Aboriginal person, I can talk to him or her. And two, they can operate in our modern world. Roy then concluded his letter by saying, please hang in there and do not let the fools who think they can implement all of the recommendations of the TRC committee. It would destroy our nation. Pretty revealing. So these writers promoted the merits of forced assimilation and defended residential schooling and attacks on Indigenous lifeways generally as immensely beneficial to Canada and Canadians because it protects and extends the colonial status quo. Whether through personal knowledge, ignorance and anti-Indigenous racism, or a belief in assimilation as beneficent, or a combination of these, Bayek's supporters, catalyzed by Bayek's original comments, employed denialism to distance themselves from the effects of residential schooling and to defend ongoing colonization and the power and privilege it affords them as commonsensical. Indeed, Memy explains that this kind of behavior reassures colonizers who accept that colonization is eternal, and it encourages them to look towards their future, quote, without any worries of any kind. Okay, to conclude, and then we've got lots of time for questions. Although Bayek has now retired, the residential school denialism she helped popularize remains a key barrier to reconciliation, as Murray Sinclair recently pointed out. Indeed, Bayek's comments defending residential schooling and trying to undermine public confidence in the TRC's report and her support letters are but one example of the growing phenomenon of residential school denialism. There are so many examples that I could do a whole other hour talk just looking at the last couple of weeks. But let me give you a sample from the last couple of years. So more recently, a teacher in Abbotsford, BC, assigned a homework assignment where students were instructed to search for online articles outlining the positive experiences of residential schooling, kind of leading students towards some of these posts. As educators, I think we can understand how that is misleading and disingenuous. Similarly, former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien spread denialism on Montreal radio talk show where he sort of compared his own experience in an elite private boarding school to residential schooling, saying, you know, what's the big deal? To former federal conservative leader Erin O'Toole, who was caught on camera at TMU, coaching young conservatives on how to manipulate residential school history to score political points. If you go and look at the video, he's basically like, oh, downplay John A. Macdonald's involvement and like focus on the liberal involvement. When in reality, as we know, the residential school system was a bipartisan project. As well, a number of academics, many of them retired and well known to us, often being led by Tom Flanagan, etc., have engaged in or supported denialism, denigrating Indigenous communities, searching the former sites of residential schools for potential unmarked graves, suggesting the whole thing is just a big lie, fake news, a hoax. It's pretty disgusting. It's mostly just a handful of the same sad people, the usual suspects, but increasingly these kinds of acts of denialism are getting a lot of attention, including increasingly politicians starting to legitimize denialist discourse as a way of garnering support among, in particular, far-right conspiratorial types. As examples here, this is Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who spread the mass grave hoax narrative on her for-profit social media platform. Current Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre was in Winnipeg recently giving a fundraising talk for the Frontier Centre, a far-right think tank that has done much to spread residential school denialism, including in 2008, taking out radio ads questioning the truths about the system, to an alleged serial killer here in Winnipeg who targeted Indigenous women, posting residential school denialism, the mass grave hoax narrative stuff in particular, at the time of his murders. So these examples of denialism all seek to misrepresent residential school history in ways that downplay the system's devastating effects and shakes public confidence in what we know about residential school history for a variety of purposes. And my argument is that we need to take these attacks on truth and reconciliation seriously. The special interlocutor helping communities with their searches at former residential schools, identified denialism as one of the key barriers to this work, and in particular has called on non-Indigenous people to step up and take responsibility for identifying and confronting this stuff, because there's a tendency to think this is just like mean things that people say on the internet. But increasingly, this is creating a sort of backlash identity that is playing out in actual physical behavior, including showing up at former residential schools in the middle of the night with shovels, demanding to see proof of bodies, or else everything is a hoax. And this is incredibly damaging to communities, many of which are undergoing a very re-triggering process of bringing out this history. And really, it's an intimidation tactic. And it's not just happening online, it is manifesting in physical and real world behavior. Okay, let's conclude and get on with our discussion. So denialists then, in my view, should not be simply seen as being dim-witted. Instead, they should be seen as being afraid of reconciliation, right? That they see it as a threat. It will unsettle their material interests and position of power in colonial society, personally or politically. In keeping with Memi's profile of the colonizer who accepts, Beck and other residential school denialists are choosing to seek refuge in an assemblage of misinformation and untruths. This, however, is a false refuge. Denying the colonial past and present prevents settlers from being part of the project of reconciliation and the efforts to build sustainable and reciprocal relations with Indigenous peoples that could resolve their crisis of legitimacy and help them live in the lands currently called Canada in good or at least better ways. Thus, contrary to Beck's response when she was pressed by a reporter about her defense of residential schools, right, that she didn't need any more education, it is clear that actually what is needed in our current era of truth and reconciliation is more and not less education about the ongoing effects of Canadian colonization and the opportunities for all in deep, meaningful, and unsettling reconciliation. In fact, Murray Sinclair always says that education, right, is what got us into this mess, and education is what's needed to get us out. And I want to commend all of you for coming and committing to that path today and having a conversation about it. So, final thought, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was very clear in its final report that reconciliation is not actually an Indigenous problem, it is a Canadian responsibility. And learning how to identify and confront residential school denialism in a variety of settings, whether it be at work, at home, in your community, is one way that you individually and as a community can help put truth before reconciliation. Okay, thank you very much.